This episode of Dispatches from Planet Albany is brought to you with support by New York State United Teachers, which represents more than 600,000 educators and school-related professionals in New York. Dispatches is also supported by the public affairs firm O'Donnell & Associates. For more information, check out o'donnellsolutions.com.
This episode is also brought to you by Citizens for Affordable Rates. New York's car insurance costs are nearly double the national average, and state lawmakers must take action to make driving more affordable. Learn more at citizensforaffordablerate.com.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of D.C., and Eddie Vedder comes out. And he goes, "You have a cigarette?" And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is Dispatches from Planet Albany, a podcast about power and policy in New York. And on today's episode, we're sitting down with Assemblymember Sam Berger, a Queens Democrat who's one of a handful of Orthodox Jews in the state legislature, and joined us in the studio to talk about his experience as a Orthodox Jew, navigating politics here in Planet Albany and back home in his district. Well, for starters, I want to talk about the role that Judaism plays in your life, and specifically your political identity, because I'm Jewish, my mom is Jewish, but it doesn't dominate any aspect of my day-to-day activities. I celebrate high holidays, I have an affinity for guttural sounds, and I take advantage of the jokes when possible, but that's about it. We can get into what Judaism means for your political views in a second, but in terms of your day-to-day existence, especially at the Capitol, what does being Jewish mean to you?
For an Orthodox Jew, it's part of your everyday life. Every aspect of your life has an element of Judaism to it, right? From the morning that you get up, right? We have a blessing that you're supposed to say. There's, ways that you tie your shoes, how you're supposed to, ways on how you dress, the obligation to pray 3 times a day, keeping kosher, being mindful of the food that's around you, being mindful of how you're supposed to act. So it's something that really carries with you throughout the entirety of the day.
And for anyone who has seen Fiddler on the Roof, the reference to this is basically, we've got rules for everything, and, we even have a prayer for the Tsar. So it definitely can, if you, are a believer and want to live that lifestyle, it can dominate every aspect of your life, like you're saying, right?
Right. And the idea behind that is that, each of these decisions that you're making, each aspect that you're doing, it's for that idea of how do I connect closer to Hashem, right? Our name for God. Every aspect you're supposed to be having in mindful of, I am doing something so that in this way I can connect, closer to Hashem. A lot of that is done, I think, through elements of giving. At least for me, how I connect to Hashem is through, acts of kindness, acts of giving to others and helping other people.
Is it easy to maintain that connection here at the Capitol, or are there times when you're like, sorry, God, you're going to have to give me a pass on this one because conference went long, or because I had to debate a bill, or I had to travel on a train to get to Albany for a session day we didn't plan or something?
It's a lot harder in an area like Albany, which is a little more isolated from the Jewish community, so you're a little bit more on your own. However, I built in mechanisms for myself to help make sure that I'm walking into each day with that same mindset of my surroundings. So every morning, I have a friend of mine. We've been learning together for about 7 years. We study Talmudic law, and the whole point of studying Talmudic law is to connect closer to Hashem and to be mindful of that. That idea that it's still with you for the rest of the day. So I try to start the morning off like that because I'm in the judiciary. We're doing the Talmudic law and judiciary. I think by starting off your day with that element of Judaism, it makes sure that, I have that reminder every morning that, yes, I'm in Albany. Yes, I'm alone, in a lot of areas. But at the same time, there's still that obligation, for me to make sure that I'm not forgetting, where I come from and what my values are.
Well, what about those values and how they might manifest themselves in your political identity? Because across the street, there's the idea of the cafeteria Catholic, picking and choosing what elements of their religious faith is going to inform their political beliefs. Does that same sort of principle apply to you?
I think a lot of my beliefs, the Orthodox Jewish beliefs kind of lend themselves to somewhere, in the middle, something where, very moderate, which is what my district is. I have a very diverse district. Queens is the world's borough. I have a little bit of every community, But what I found, in going, from Kew Garden Hills or Forest Hills or going up to College Point or Whitestone in Queens, is everyone has, very, very similar moderate values, at least in my district. And so there's rarely a time where I'm picking my religion over picking my political values. They're very much one and the same.
Well, you say the idea of a moderate approach. I think most people would, though, have the perception, rightly or wrongly, that being Orthodox Jewish means conservative, particularly on social issues. Do you feel like that's not the case?
No, I mean, the idea behind, within Judaism, we're very much about giving back to the community. There's all these different nonprofits set up to help people in every sort of struggle that they find themselves in. Right? We have Hatzalah, which is a wonderful EMS program. We have Chaverim, which is a program full of volunteers to help people, sort of like AAA, but they do it free of charge. We have Queen Shmira, which is a nonprofit organization that helps with public safety. So they understand a little bit more of the cultural issues of the Jewish community, but they work hand in hand with the NYPD to try and just supplement a little bit and help make sure that people's needs are being heard. So that idea of giving back and that principle behind having social services is very much rooted in the Jewish community.
But the Old Testament God is generally perceived to be a little more vengeful, a little more angry, a little less forgiving than that New Testament God, who is considered a little more touchy-feely, a little more sympathetic and understanding. And the idea would be that translates on issues of like abortion or transgender rights. I mean, you don't feel like on those issues the religion spills over?
No, okay. I don't think so. I think we may be having different reads of it, but my faith is very much about love and kindness. Where you have disagreements on somebody based on their values, that does not mean that therefore you have a reason to then hate them, right? I can disagree with you and still love you and still want to be.
Oh yeah, I don't think I'm saying that. I'm saying you might say, well, this issue like gender or the idea of ensuring Medicaid coverage for gender-affirming care. Well, I understand why that's important to you, but because of my faith or my reading of my faith, it's not something I can support.
There's rarely been a case, I think, in Albany where I've had to vote based solely on faith.
I want to come back to your day-to-day experience, and I'm curious what sort of casual anti-Semitism you experience, because there's obviously going to be people who target you. They say, oh, there's an Orthodox Jew, I can recognize of him because he's got his head covered, or maybe with who he associates, and I'm going to go swing for the fences in terms of hate crimes. But what about the more casual anti-Semitism, the people who might do, little things about people being cheap or whatever? Do you experience that in the Capitol at all?
What I find often, most often happen, right? There's a difference between anti-Semitism and non-understanding, right? There are people who just don't understand what it is that what kosher means, what observing the Sabbath means. That's okay. That's not hateful. That's, not just. There's a lot.
Does that happen? Do people go, Saturday? I thought the big day was Sunday.
I mean, I get invited to go have dinner, at some Italian restaurant that I have to say, okay, that's fine, but I'll have the water. But that's not.
And probably can't go Friday night.
And it cannot go Friday night. Yeah. But that's not what I would call anti-Semitism. I think what we're seeing right now, I think what I've seen right now, a lot of my constituency right now, this idea of anti-Zionism being an acceptable form of hate, where and it's completely unrelated to anti-Semitism.
And what does anti-Zionism mean to you?
To me, it's a the idea that it is acceptable to hate somebody who is supportive of the state of Israel.
And you feel like it's a hatred and not just saying, I don't support that country's policies, I hate those people, is how you read it.
I do read it as it is a form of hatred. And you have more people at the, sort of in the higher education field, the sort of the intellectual elite, who it's more of a nuanced debate that happens. But when you trickle down to the day-to-day protesters, the day-to-day people who are acting upon this belief, it comes from a little bit more of a form of hatred. And you see this, I think from the Jewish perspective, the way I look at it is, people are coming up to me, calling me a Zionist. They don't, without having a single conversation about Israel. Right, we're not talking about this. There's no, how do you feel about the country? How do you feel about the actions? No conversation whatsoever. But I will be labeled a Zionist. I have been labeled a Zionist. And Zionism is a word that I didn't really grow up with. We didn't have that, as part of our conversation. It wasn't something I really heard till, I think till more of my young adult years, where there was this concept of Zionists, that you are a Zionist. Because
is that an insult in that connotation?
The way it's been treated is as an insult, right? That's a bad thing to be a Zionist. I don't find it to be.
From my research, I saw you even were running for the World Zionist Congress. So is the correct nomenclature that guy's a Zionist or that guy's a Congress member?
It's become for me something where it's like, if this is the name that they're going to use as an excuse to hate me, and then I will own that name and I'll be okay with that. It's not the way I saw myself, but it's the way that a way that I will wear that on my sleeve now, because you're using that as an excuse to hate on me. And there's plenty of constituents of mine who they're struggling, whether it's at their job or in a university, where they're being labeled without having any actual substantive conversation. And even if there was a substantive conversation, that label is not an excuse now to then hate on them, to discriminate against them. But we're seeing it over and over and over again.
Some challenges need someone who simply won't quit. Modern advocacy brings tenacity, strategy, and unwavering follow-through to every client it serves. Learn more at modernadvocacyllc.com.
Fraud and unnecessary lawsuits are driving up car insurance costs for New Yorkers. That's why lawmakers should support Governor Hochul's efforts to stop bad actors from gaming the system. Visit keepnewyorkaffordable.org to learn more.
We had March 2nd and March 3rd off at the Capitol, and there was some behind-the-scenes questioning about how did we get those Jewish holiday days off, and there wasn't maybe a assumption that Purim would be off. Do you have any insights into how that came together, and what do you think about the legislature taking those days off?
Well, from my experience, we've always had off on Purim.
Okay.
So you have Purim is made up of technically 3 days, right? The first day is called Tanis Esther. That's when we fast, right? We don't eat in remembrance of the fast that Esther, the Queen Esther in Persia, took upon herself. And then when you get into the nighttime, because Jewish days start in the previous night, that's why when we have the Sabbath starts on Friday night. So when you get to that night of the first day, that's when we have to hear the Megillah being read, the story of Purim being read, and then we can break our fast. The next day is when we're really celebrating Purim, when there's an obligation to go out to your neighbors and give them, and give food. There's an obligation to give money to the poor. We say that if anyone comes knocking on your door asking for money for charity, that you have an obligation to give something. So we have that. We celebrate that. It's a really beautiful holiday. It's really you get to go out there. You see members of the community being out and about, enjoying one another's company. We have a big meal at the end of it. It's a very lovely holiday.
How would you rank it in terms of importance of Jewish holidays? Because I'm often asked this question by my Christian friends or my sort of atheist and agnostic friends who have that experience growing up in public schools where Hanukkah gets all the play. And I have to explain to them, even from my rudimentary knowledge, not that big of a deal compared to like Passover, Yom Kippur, and Rosh Hashanah. So where does Purim rank?
From a religious perspective, Purim is on the same playing field as Hanukkah, right? It was instituted afterwards. It's not directly alluded to in the Torah itself. Whereas you have the high holidays, which is Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, and Shavuos.
And that's like the majors for golf fans.
The majors for golf fans, yes.
Yeah. And sticking with Purim, have you seen the Christopher Guest movie For Your Consideration, which starts out as a celebration about Purim, and then it becomes like home for Thanksgiving?
I have not seen it.
Oh, excellent. Well, you have to check that out. It's supposed to be this very intimate, and it's a satire on the movie industry. But regardless, we can do movie talk some other time. The idea of educating people, though, I'm curious, do any of your members, your fellow members, come to you and say, hey, what was that holiday we had off? Or why are we doing this? Or what is this? And do you appreciate that because it means people are interested? Or is there a downside to that?
No, I think there are certainly plenty of colleagues who have asked about holidays, about kosher, about the Sabbath, and we've had those conversations. I'm always happy to talk about what it is and what it means, and it's been very heartwarming to see that there are people who are interested, who are curious about the day-to-day living of the Orthodox Jewish community. Anything
stand out in particular?
Typically, there's a lot of conversations about kosher and how that works and how that functions. Right? It's not just can't eat pig. And trying to explain that to people, that there's a lot of laws that when you have a rabbi, that what a rabbi is not looked at the Jewish community the same way we would look at a priest. Rabbis are kind of Jewish lawyers, right? In order to get your what we call smicha, right, your certification to become a rabbi, you are typically learning, becoming very, very knowledgeable on a specific area of Jewish law. Typically, the most common one is on the laws of kosher. They're extremely complicated.
Well, sticking with that aspect then, snacking is a big part of life in the legislature, especially on these long session days when the budget process stretches out. There's a pretty good spread, or at least a wide spread of things that lawmakers can grab. Is anything accessible to you?
Yeah, the New York State Assembly is very good about making sure that there is some things, in the members' lounge that are kosher. This morning, right, they went. There's a Price Chopper about 30-minute drive away that sells some kosher food, so they get bagels,
nice
bread.
But then that brings up a whole issue about New York City bagel eaters having to come and eat a bagel in Albany. I mean, is that a problem?
I can confidently say Queens bagels are a lot better than Albany bagels.
Okay. Well, luckily, I don't think anyone was making the claim that Albany was going to be better. So I don't know if you had to go get that defensive about it. But pivoting to a simpler topic, Israel. Do you feel, broadly speaking, that there can be criticism of Israel that is not anti-Semitism and that it is just a good faith criticism of a standalone country's foreign policies or internal domestic policies?
Absolutely.
And what does that look like compared to when you feel like it crosses a line into anti-Semitism?
I think where you cross the line is when you find yourself in a double standard situation. When you have, when you're focusing on specifically Israel in a very, very antagonistic way that you wouldn't do for the myriad of other countries that are committing horrendous crimes. That's where I find that it's not a conversation or dialogue in good faith.
Are there any particular examples that come to mind where someone might flag something and say, well, look at this behavior, and then you would say, well, it's also happening here?
Can you clarify that?
So it sounds like you're making the case that people are selective in the activities that they want to single out. And I'm curious if there are examples of things where you say, oh, well, Israel, you're alleging Israel is doing this. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But this other country is, doing something that would approximate the same concern that you have that Israel's allegedly doing.
Yeah, I would say, look, there was a piece of legislation that on our Dime Act, which, solely focused on Israel and penalized being supportive of Israel in New York State. And if you want to have that conversation about what Israel is or is not doing, okay, that's fine. But if you're going to put out legislation that does not talk about any of the other countries that are known, that there's not an argument as to whether or not what they're doing is morally correct or incorrect, and you're not going to include those, then I don't really believe that when you say that your legislation is meant in good faith and you're just trying to abide by international law.
And that bill had to do with like charitable tax contributions. So is there a case to be made then that the right response to that is just to make it broader in nature, and that simply, responds to concerns you might have?
I think it's a much different conversation when you have a blanket bill that would, talk about Iran and talk about China or Russia or many other countries, and Israel be a part of that. When you're holding them to the same standard, then I think that's fair. And you are welcome to criticize and have conversations about them and critique them. That's fair. But if you're solely focused on them, we find oftentimes it just becomes sort of like a scapegoat. And this is where I go back to that idea where people are saying, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. It's just that anybody who identifies as a Jew to me is going to appear as a Zionist. That's where you kind of run into those blurred lines that the people who are more debating on a higher intellectual level would like to separate with the nuance, but it's not really there on the ground level.
What about politicians who might be pandering on Israel issues? Do you feel like there are people who wrap themselves in the Israeli flag, but if, left to their own devices would probably not want to even be like around Jews? Do you think that's something that happens in politics today?
Unfortunately, and it happens both ways. You have people who don't really have an opinion about what Israel is or is not doing, but they'll also wrap themselves in hatred towards Israel because right now that's the hot thing.
Does that ever create uncomfortable situations here at the Capitol for you?
Sometimes. I think the State Assembly has been pretty good about keeping foreign politics out of the chambers. We don't really have much to do with foreign affairs, and so we keep that out in a very, very content-neutral way that I appreciate.
When bad actors stage car accidents, we all pay the price. Fraud and lawsuit abuse are driving up car insurance costs for New Yorkers. Governor Hochul is reforming liability laws to stop lawyers from gaming the system and help lower insurance costs. Florida made similar changes. Insurance costs are going down for most drivers, some up to 20%. Visit keepnewyorkaffordable.org to learn how these changes will put money back in your pocket and restore fairness to the civil justice system.
Well, sticking with something then that is very relevant to the legislature, education, and specifically the yeshiva experience, which you have said has been targeted and put under baseless scrutiny. To me, though, that sounds like some level of pandering, given the depth of the New York Times reporting and the subsequent follow-up by the city education officials who looked into the experience at some yeshivas. So how do you navigate this issue, given your own personal experience, which obviously has probably shaped your experience, but also the political angle and the constituencies that you need to be responsive to? I mean, do you feel like you're in a position to potentially acknowledge legitimate critiques if they're raised, or is that difficult given, who you are and the constituencies that you might need to be responsive to?
I think that New York Times article was the epitome of going to the Amazon rainforest, taking a picture of the dirt, on the ground,
okay,
and then making an article about, this is the Amazon rainforest, right? That was the picture. Was, yes, you found something that's problematic. That's what you harped on. That's what you focused and zeroed in on. But if you had actually wanted to have a conversation in good faith, you would have gone around, which they did not do. I grew up, in the issue of education. I'm proud of that education, very much so. I am the man I am today because of the education. I was able to go through law school because, starting in 5th grade, I started learning Talmudic law. I started learning critical thinking. I started learning a lot of the, skills that enabled me, to practice as a lawyer and to, practice as a legislator. And I wish, having spent so much time going to my public schools in the district, I wish that we could bring that level of education that we have in yeshivas over to the public schools. And I've been having conversations to get more of those principals to come over and see what we're doing in yeshivas. My father, for about 25, 30 years right now, has been the president of a girls' elementary school. He does it. It's a completely volunteer service. I've seen the years off of his life that it's taken him just trying to run a school, but it is one that was doing social emotional awareness long before anyone in New York State was doing it. That was focusing on how do we make sure that we're treating each child as an individual and making sure that we're giving them the tools they need to succeed in their way. Right, in the best way that they can, not in the cookie cutter way that we think of what is a model student. I've seen that not just in that school, but in many of the other schools in Queens. And there's no conversations about that. There's no articles about that being talked about. I think there was solely a focus on we have a sort of a chip on our shoulder, a problem that we have when it comes to yeshiva education. Someone had a bad experience somewhere, and now we want to make that the story. And I find it was truly offensive to see that, because you're not really, if you want to just talk about flaws and you're not willing to look at the entirety of the story, you're not willing to look at the entirety of the rainforest that's there, then you're not really having a conversation in good faith.
My pushback, though, would be I went to Saratoga Springs City School District, had a perfectly good experience. If the Times-Union writes a story about the Albany City School District and that it's failing kids, I don't get mad at that and read that and say, well, you're attacking the public school system more broadly. I would say, oh, it looks like there's a school district that is in need of help and maybe it needs additional oversight. And why isn't that the read when it comes to this issue, that you would say, yeah, I had a good school and maybe the vast majority are good. And this New York Times reporting really underscores that there are some that are maybe failing kids, and thus we need to figure out why are these schools failing those kids, and let's give education officials the resources they need to go after them, give the authority to improve that experience so the kids have a better experience.
Because I think it was a lot more about harping on just the flaws. And that article went to about, I think, 2 or 3 schools in the 450 schools that are throughout the yeshiva. Throughout the yeshiva system, there wasn't no broad approach. There was no interest in having a broad.
But it doesn't need to be a broder story about. I mean, they're highlighting here are some problem schools. It's like anytime we have a big issue.
You did legislation that affected the entirety of the yeshiva system, and you had schools like mine in Queens, which I believe they outperform the public schools when it comes to testing. But we're still getting emails from the state education department saying we're going to come to your schools. We get to look at your schools. We get to investigate your schools. And even if you go through all of the pathways that we've laid out and you go through everything with flying colors, we still have the right to come to your schools and tell you what to do.
But that isn't actually how things played out. I mean, in part because they made changes, but when we saw like city education officials get involved, they did identify 18 yeshivas that there were concerns about, and they weren't necessarily going to, as you said, the high-performing schools and saying, you need to redo everything. So, I mean, is there reason to necessarily be concerned about that intrusion? Is there a level of defensiveness that may not be warranted?
I think the defensiveness is warranted. It doesn't mean that there aren't flaws, but it also, I think it's certainly warranted in the heavy-handedness in which we have been attacked. And I can only speak to the Queen's School.
And you're saying we have been attacked?
Yeah.
Because you feel like it's a we issue.
Yeah, because for the first time, I went through the yeshiva education. I was proud of my education. And for the first time when I went to law school, that was the first time I had to experience my education being questioned. Oh, you went to a yeshiva, right? I was so thrilled with my education. I loved my teachers. I certainly had some bad teachers. I don't think there's.
Would you like to call them out right now? You don't have to do that.
I don't believe so, but I was proud of my education. My first time where I really encountered the secular world in law school was where I was first finally being told that my education is being looked at as inferior solely because it's yeshiva education. So I am defensive of that. And that's my experience in Queens. I've had all of my friends, I think even the ones who struggled in school the most, are still doing very, very well for themselves, have found ways to succeed very much so, and that was because of the yeshiva education that they got. And to see the hit that's been put out, this smear, I think that's the way that I look at it. I think that's why I get defensive about it. It's because there has been no real effort to, from the same people who want to attack on it, there's no effort to actually shine a light on it either. And I think that's not then looking at a balanced approach. I think if you're looking at something and saying that there's merits and there's problems, right, and we want to acknowledge the merits, we want to look at the problems, that's fine, right? But again, it goes to that sort of double standard that's there.
Well, finally, anything else that you wanted to touch on that we didn't get to?
I think I do wish, for the media's, looking at it from a media perspective, I wish that there was more of a look at what Orthodox Judaism is and the lifestyle that we have. I wish people could see.
How would you recommend journalists get into that conversation? Because I do think for some it's an uncomfortable one where they're like, well, am I going to have backlash for asking this question or that question? Or if I look into something and I, provide my independent perspective, we hear from both sides, and it's not the story that somebody likes, maybe I'm going to be accused of being anti-Semitic. So what do you think is the best way to get into that world?
I think just like in politics, where there's nothing that you can do with that's going to make everybody happy, it's still important to do. Right?
Okay.
To try and do, if you're coming at it from a good faith perspective of I want to really just know this community and understand this community, then really trying to go and get that full forest for the trees. Perspective and having those conversations and reaching out.
Not a snapshot of the dirt of the Amazon, as you would put it?
Not a snapshot of the dirt of the Amazon, right? Go look at the trees, go look at the flowers, and yeah, there's going to be some dirt there. There's always dirt. But at the same time, there's a lot more that we have to offer. There's a lot of amazing work that we do. I am able to do what I do as a legislator because of my Jewish values that are rooted in helping other people. Right, no matter who they are, no matter their race or religion or their faith, I think that has what has driven me in the past 3 years as legislator, to be successful at what I do, because I want to be able to help.
Well, thank you so much for making the time, Assemblyman. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And I'll wait for you to finish chastising, hopefully a dog, not a human being.